It was a quiet Monday morning at Westbridge University. The hallways buzzed with the usual chatter of students heading to class, clutching their coffee cups and backpacks. But in the criminal justice building, something unusual was about to unfold. Steven Seagal. Yes, that Steven Seagal walked calmly through the corridor wearing dark jeans, a plain black t-shirt and his signature leather jacket. His hair was neatly tied back, his stride slow and deliberate. He wasn't there as an actor today. He'd been invited by Dean Roberts to give a surprise guest lecture on respect, discipline, and the law. But no one had told the new campus security officer, Blake Turner. Fresh out of academy training and eager to prove himself, Blake was stationed near the classroom door when he spotted Seagal walking in. To him, the man looked out of place, the jacket, the shades, the quiet confidence. Blake thought he was just another intruder trying to sneak in. "Sir," Blake called out, stepping forward with authority. "This area is for students and faculty only. I'm going to need to see some ID." Seagal stopped, turned slightly, and looked at him. His calm eyes behind those dark lenses didn't flinch. "Good morning, officer," he said in a low, steady voice. "I'm here for the class," Blake frowned. "Class as a student?" "No," Seagal replied, removing his sunglasses. "As the instructor." A few students lingering nearby glanced over, whispering to one another. The tall man before them did look familiar, but Blake wasn't buying it. "Nice try," the guard said with a smirk. "You expect me to believe you're teaching here dressed like that?" "Come on, sir, show me your ID or step outside." The air in the hallway grew tense. Seagal didn't raise his voice, didn't even look annoyed. He simply folded his arms, studying the young officer like a patient teacher studying a student. "Son," he said quietly, "sometimes you need to look closer before you make a mistake." But Blake only straightened his posture, convinced he was in the right. What happened next made the entire classroom go silent. Steven Seagal stood still, arms crossed, calm as a mountain, while the young security guard grew more irritated by the second. Officer Blake Turner adjusted his badge, glancing around at the small crowd that had begun to form near the classroom door. A few students stood frozen, phones halfway out of their pockets, sensing something interesting was unfolding. Blake's voice was firm, his tone sharp. "Sir, this isn't a joke. I need to see some identification right now or I'll have to escort you off campus." Seagal didn't move. He simply looked at him and said quietly, "You might want to take a moment and think about who you're talking to." Blake scoffed. "Oh, I'm thinking, believe me. And I'm thinking you're not supposed to be here." Behind them, a couple of students whispered, "Wait, isn't that Steven Seagal? The movie guy?" Another shook her head. "No way, why would he be here?" The situation was growing awkward by the second. Seagal, a man who had trained military officers and law enforcement for decades, found himself being treated like an intruder in a classroom he'd been invited to teach in. But instead of losing his temper, he stayed silent. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, the kind that comes from inexperience and overconfidence. He knew exactly how to handle it. "Son," Seagal said finally, "I don't want to embarrass you. Just check with your dean before you make any decisions you'll regret." But Blake wasn't listening. He waved his hand dismissively. "That's not how it works. Nobody walks past me without clearance. So either you show me ID or step outside now." A hush fell over the hallway. Seagal took one slow step closer, his eyes steady. "I respect your duty," he said calmly, "but respect should go both ways." Blake's jaw tightened. "Don't lecture me on respect. You're the one refusing to follow orders." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. One of the students recording whispered under her breath, "Man, he's gonna regret this." Still, Seagal didn't raise his voice. Instead, he gave a small, almost knowing smile, the kind that said he'd seen 1,000 confrontations like this and didn't need to prove anything. Then, he turned slightly and began walking toward the classroom door. That's when Blake reached out and blocked him with his arm. "Sir, I said you're not going anywhere." The sound of chairs shifting came from inside the classroom. A few students peeked out, curious about what was happening. Seagal looked down at the guard's arm resting in front of him, then back up into his eyes. "Move your arm," Seagal said softly. Something about the tone, low, calm and powerful, made even the nearby students take a step back. Blake hesitated but didn't back down. "Don't test me," he said, trying to sound firm. "I can have you detained." Seagal raised an eyebrow. "Detained for what? Walking into a classroom I was invited to?" That's when a student called out from the doorway, "Hey, I think he is Steven Seagal." Blake shot the student a glare. "Stay out of this." But more whispers spread through the hallway. "It is him. Look at his face. That's Steven Seagal." Blake's expression flickered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "If you're really him," he said, "then prove it. Show me some identification." Seagal chuckled under his breath, not out of arrogance, but disbelief. "You really want me to prove who I am in a classroom where my name's on the schedule?" He motioned toward the door. On the glass, printed neatly in bold letters, was a flyer. Guest lecture, Steven Seagal, Law, Discipline, and Respect in Modern Policing. The crowd went quiet. Blake blinked twice, staring at the poster, but it was too late. His voice had already been raised, his tone already disrespectful, his attitude already on full display. Seagal sighed softly. "I tried to warn you," he said, and with that he turned back toward the students. Blake stood frozen, embarrassed, but too proud to apologize. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. Seagal paused, hand on the doorframe, and said without looking back, "Neither is your lesson." He walked into the classroom, placed his sunglasses on the desk, and looked around at the stunned faces waiting for him to speak. Outside, Blake stood alone in the hallway, realizing this was spiraling far beyond what he had expected. Have you ever been disrespected by someone who didn't know who you really were? Share your story in the comments below, and tell us which country and city you're watching from. We love seeing where our global family is tuning in from. Inside the classroom, silence filled the air. Every student stared at Steven Seagal as he calmly set his sunglasses on the desk, as if nothing had happened. His composure was unshakable, the calm before a storm that only he could control. But outside, Officer Blake was fuming. His pride was bruised. In his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was just doing his job. And yet everyone who'd witnessed the standoff looked at him differently now. He could feel their eyes judging him, whispering behind his back. He clenched his jaw and muttered, "I'm not done with this guy." Blake stormed into the classroom, his voice echoing off the walls. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. You can't just walk in here without clearance. I don't care what that paper says. You're not authorized to be in this room." The students exchanged nervous glances. Seagal didn't turn around right away. He simply adjusted the chair in front of him, then slowly stood up to face the guard. "I told you," Seagal said quietly. "I was invited." Blake's frustration was boiling over. Invited by who? Because as far as I'm concerned, you're trespassing on university property. Seagal's tone remained steady, that deep, calm voice that could silence a room without needing to shout. "Young man, I've spent more years teaching law enforcement than you've spent enforcing it. You should learn to observe before you accuse." The word stung. A few students chuckled under their breath. Blake's face turned red. "Don't talk down to me," he barked. "You think you can walk in here and act like you own the place?" Seagal took a step closer, not in anger but with quiet authority. His presence alone seemed to lower the temperature of the room. "I don't act like I own anything," he said, "but I do know the difference between authority and abuse of it." For a moment, no one breathed. The tension hung in the air like a drawn sword. Then Blake snapped. "That's it," he said. "I'm calling campus police." He reached for his radio, but before he could press the button, Seagal spoke again, his voice so calm it almost sounded like a whisper. "You really want to make that call? Think about what story they'll hear. A security guard harassing a guest lecturer in front of 50 witnesses. The entire class froze. Blake's thumb hovered over the radio button. He hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I don't care who you are," he said through gritted teeth. "Rules are rules." Seagal nodded slightly, almost respectfully. "And respect is respect. Unfortunately, you seem to be missing both." A ripple of laughter spread through the class. Even those who'd been nervous couldn't help but smirk. The young guard looked furious, but somewhere deep inside he knew Seagal was right. Still, he took one step forward, standing toe-to-toe with the man he'd just insulted. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Seagal didn't move an inch. "I don't think," he said. "I know." Blake's breathing grew heavier. The class watched, phones raised, recording every second. Seagal could feel the heat of the moment, the mix of tension, pride, and humiliation. But he wouldn't let it explode. He turned away, calmly picked up a piece of chalk and wrote one word on the board: respect. He turned back to the class and said, "This This right here is lesson number 1. Everyone fell silent again. Even Blake hesitated, unsure what to do. Respect, Seagal continued, isn't about who has the badge or who gives the orders. It's about understanding that every person deserves to be treated fairly until proven otherwise. He looked directly at the guard. Even when you think you're right, you still have a choice, to listen or to humiliate. For a brief moment, Blake's expression softened, just a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But then his ego kicked back in. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I'm not standing here and getting lectured by some actor. Seagal simply smiled. That's your mistake, son. You see an actor, but what you don't see is the man who's trained thousands of officers just like you. Some of them learned fast, others, he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, had to learn the hard way. The guard froze, unsure how to respond. The class erupted in quiet laughter, half in awe, half in disbelief at how calmly Seagal was dismantling him, word by word. Before Blake could speak again, one student raised her hand timidly. Sir, if I may, I think we've all learned something important before the lecture even began. Seagal smiled faintly. That's the beauty of real lessons, he said. They don't always come from books. The guard took a step back, humiliated and unsure what to do next. His authority had crumbled in front of everyone. But Seagal, rather than gloat, just nodded and gestured toward an empty chair. Sit down, he said quietly. You might learn something. And to everyone's surprise, Blake did. If you were standing there watching this unfold, what would you do? Step in to defend Steven or stay silent and let it play out? Tell us your answer in the comments below. The room remained frozen, the kind of silence you could feel. Officer Blake sat there, every muscle in his body tense, his pride battling his conscience. Around him, students exchanged uncertain looks, some whispering, others pretending to focus on the lesson. But all eyes kept flicking back to the tall man at the front of the class, Steven Seagal. Seagal, meanwhile, was perfectly calm. He picked up a marker and began writing a few words on the board. Justice, integrity, awareness. These, he said slowly, his voice deep and deliberate, are the foundations of law. You can memorize every code in the book, but if you don't understand these 3 principles, you'll never be a protector, only an enforcer. His tone carried the kind of weight that only comes from experience. The class was spellbound. Even Blake, sitting stiffly in the corner, couldn't look away. Seagal continued, justice means balance. It's not about power. It's about doing what's right even when no one's watching. Integrity means standing for truth even when it costs you something. And awareness, he paused, looking directly at the young guard, means seeing beyond what's in front of you. A hush followed. The students were completely absorbed, and then the door creaked open. Dean Roberts stepped inside, adjusting his glasses, a folder tucked under his arm. He froze when he saw the crowd, the phones, and the unmistakable presence of Steven Seagal standing at the front of the room. Ah, the dean said with a warm smile. I see our guest has already begun. The students turned their heads toward the dean, eyes wide. Blake's jaw nearly dropped. Guest? He whispered, almost to himself. Seagal gave the dean a polite nod. We got started a little early, the dean chuckled. I can see that. I heard some noise in the hall. I didn't realize it was part of the lesson. A few students laughed softly, but Blake wasn't laughing. He was staring straight ahead, trying to process what he'd just heard. Wait, he said quietly. Guest, you mean he really is supposed to be here? The dean looked at him, slightly puzzled. Of course. This is Mr. Steven Seagal, guest lecturer, law enforcement trainer, and honorary professor for the week. The words hit like a punch. Blake's face went pale. Around him, the class erupted in murmurs, some amused, others stunned. Phones were still rolling, capturing every second of his humiliation. Seagal didn't gloat. He simply crossed his arms and gave the young officer a steady look, the kind of look that wasn't meant to shame, but to teach. Seems like the misunderstanding's been cleared up, Seagal said calmly. The dean frowned slightly, sensing the tension. Is there a problem here? Blake opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. Finally, he stammered, I didn't know, sir. I thought he was just an intruder. Seagal finished gently. Someone who didn't belong? Blake swallowed hard and nodded. The dean sighed softly. Officer Turner, Mr. Seagal is one of the most respected martial artists and law enforcement trainers in the world. If you had taken a moment to check your messages this morning, you'd know that he was scheduled to speak. A wave of quiet laughter rippled through the class. Blake wanted to disappear. His ears burned red as he muttered, "I understand, sir." But Seagal wasn't finished, not out of cruelty, but because he saw a teaching moment. He walked slowly toward the officer, stopping just a few feet away. His voice dropped lower, calm and direct. "Do you know what's written on the wall outside this classroom?" Blake shook his head. Seagal pointed toward the door. "It says, 'Education begins when judgment ends.'" The officer looked down, ashamed. Seagal continued, "Every person in uniform, every person who holds authority, carries a choice to see people as threats or to see them as human. The moment you choose judgment over understanding, you stop protecting and start dividing." The words hit deeper than any punishment could. Blake's eyes glistened as he realized just how wrong he'd been. The dean nodded in approval. "Well said, Stephen. That's exactly why we wanted you here." Seagal turned back to the class. "Now," he said, "let's talk about perception. What do you see when you look at someone for the first time? Race, clothes, posture, or do you see a story of something beyond the surface?" Students began nodding. One raised her hand. "So, awareness is about looking deeper?" Seagal smiled faintly. "Exactly. When you learn to see people, not labels, you start to understand justice." The tension in the room began to melt away. Even Blake seemed calmer now and still embarrassed, but listening intently. As Seagal turned back to the board, Blake's eyes wandered across the classroom, and then they stopped on a framed certificate hanging near the wall. His heart skipped a beat. It was a law degree, issued to Stephen Frederick Seagal, signed by the very dean standing in front of him. Blake stared at it, realization flooding through him like cold water. The man he'd just disrespected wasn't just a movie star. He was a trained law expert, a decorated instructor, and someone who'd spent decades teaching people exactly like him. He whispered under his breath, "What have I done?" The camera phones kept rolling. But in that moment, it wasn't about humiliation anymore, it was about growth. Seagal turned slightly, his expression unreadable, and said quietly, "Lesson number 2, class. Never assume knowledge gives you wisdom." If you were in that classroom and saw the officer realize who Steven Seagal really was, what would your reaction be? Shocked, proud, or embarrassed for him? Comment below and let's see what you think. The classroom was still buzzing after the dean's reveal. Every student was whispering, pointing, or sneaking glances between Steven Seagal and the young officer who had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Officer Blake sat there, stiff and silent, eyes fixed on the floor. His pride was shattered, but beneath that humiliation was something deeper, realization. He'd judged a man by his looks. He'd spoken with arrogance instead of respect. And now he had to face the consequences, and not in anger or punishment, but through something far more powerful. Truth. Seagal stood quietly at the front of the room, letting the murmurs die down. Then, in that calm, commanding voice that filled every corner of the classroom, he said, "Let's start over." Everyone froze. Blake looked up confused. Seagal gestured toward him. "Officer Turner, come up here." Blake hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, Seagal raised a hand. "Come on, you're part of this class now." Slowly, Blake stood and walked to the front, his footsteps heavy. He stopped beside Seagal, avoiding eye contact. Seagal turned to the students. "You see this young man? He made a mistake. But I'm not here to embarrass him. I'm here to help him understand something most people never learn." The class grew silent again. The phones lowered. Even the dean took a step back, curious where this was going. Seagal picked up a marker and wrote one word on the board in big, bold letters: ego. Then he turned to Blake. "Tell me, son, what do you think ego means?" Blake swallowed hard. "It's pride, sir." "Thinking too highly of yourself." "Good," Seagal nodded. "But there's more. Ego is what blinds us from truth. It tells us we already know everything. It makes us forget to listen." He looked back at the class. In law enforcement, ego gets people hurt. It gets people killed. Because the moment you stop listening, you stop learning. And when you stop learning, you stop growing. A ripple of quiet agreement spread through the students. Even the dean nodded. Seagal turned back to Blake. When you saw me walk in, what did you see? Blake hesitated. Someone who didn't belong. Exactly, Seagal said. You saw the jacket, the sunglasses. You saw what you expected to see. But did you observe? Did you listen to your instinct or just your bias? Blake's face fell. I didn't observe, sir. I assumed. Seagal nodded again. And that's the lesson. Assumption is the enemy of awareness. The words landed heavy. You could feel the weight of them. Every student was hanging on his every syllable. Seagal began pacing slowly, his hands behind his back. When I was your age, I made my own mistakes. Thought I was tougher, smarter, faster than everyone else. But life has a funny way of teaching humility. You can't control respect, you can only earn it. And once you do, you must protect it with your character. He stopped and faced the class again. Character isn't shown when things go right. It's revealed when things go wrong. The class was utterly silent. Blake's eyes glistened, his voice cracking as he said, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to disrespect you. Seagal placed a firm hand on his shoulder. I know you didn't. And that's why this is a lesson, not a punishment. Then he looked back to the students and said something that would stick with them forever. Every badge, every uniform, every title, it's temporary. What lasts is how you treat people when you think no one's watching. The dean nodded with pride, and a few students even started clapping quietly. But Seagal wasn't done yet. He picked up his jacket, set it on the desk, and said, Take this off and I'm just another man. But respect doesn't come from clothes or fame or titles. It comes from discipline, from knowing who you are even when the world tests you. Then, turning to Blake, he asked, Tell me, son, what's your job? Blake stood straighter. To protect and serve. Seagal smiled faintly. Good, but remember, protect doesn't just mean from danger. It means protecting people's dignity, protecting their peace, protecting the truth. The words seemed to hit Blake like a wave. He took a deep breath, nodded, and said quietly, Yes, sir. I understand now. Seagal patted his shoulder once more. Then that's enough. You've already learned more than most officers do in their first year. The entire class erupted in applause, not just for Seagal, but for the moment itself. It wasn't about fame or embarrassment or hierarchy anymore. It was about growth. Even the dean looked impressed. Steven, he said, smiling, you've just given the most powerful lesson this university has seen in a long time. Seagal gave a small nod. Sometimes, he said, the best lessons don't come from a book. They come from mistakes. Then he looked back at the students. Remember that. If you were in Officer Blake's shoes, standing in front of everyone after realizing your mistake, would you apologize or walk away? Type your honest answer in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful life stories like this one. The applause faded slowly, replaced by an almost reverent silence. What had started as a misunderstanding had turned into one of the most powerful lessons anyone in that classroom would ever experience. Steven Seagal leaned against the desk. His posture relaxed, his voice calm but resonant. Let me tell you all something, he began. Every single one of you will face a moment like this in your life. A moment where pride and patience go to war inside you. He looked at Officer Blake. The question is, which one will you let win? Blake nodded silently, his eyes filled with humility. He wasn't the cocky, defensive officer anymore. The uniform was the same, but the man wearing it had changed. Seagal smiled faintly. You see, son, I've spent decades teaching martial arts and law enforcement officers across the world. And the toughest ones, the truly great ones, weren't the loudest or strongest. They were the ones who learned when to listen. The students were hanging on his every word. Even Dean Roberts seemed lost in thought. Arms crossed, a proud smile spreading across his face. Seagal continued, pacing slowly. Power without wisdom is dangerous. Authority without empathy is chaos. The uniform doesn't make you better than anyone. It reminds you to serve everyone. The message hit deep. You could almost feel the students reflecting on their own biases, their own assumptions. Then Seagal turned toward the wall again, the one where his framed law degree hung proudly. He gestured toward it, not as a boast, but as a symbol. Most people know me from movies, he said. They think I'm just an action guy who throws punches and breaks bones. But that's not who I am, not anymore. I studied law because I wanted to understand justice. Not the kind that happens in front of cameras, but the kind that happens in quiet rooms when no one's watching. He turned back to the class. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about understanding why people fall and helping them stand back up. The entire classroom was silent. Even Blake's breathing seemed heavy with emotion. At that moment, another man appeared at the door, one of the senior officers from campus security. He looked around, confused at the crowd and the tension. "Is everything all right here?" Before anyone could answer, the dean spoke up. "Everything's fine, Captain. In fact, I think Officer Turner here just got one of the most valuable lessons of his life." The senior officer raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who gave it to him?" The dean smiled. "Mr. Steven Seagal, our guest lecturer for the week." The captain blinked, then looked at Seagal in disbelief. "Wait, the Steven Seagal?" Seagal gave a small nod, smiling politely. "In the flesh," the older officer laughed. "Well, I'll be damned. I watched your training videos when I was a rookie." The students chuckled, and the tension in the room finally began to ease. Blake looked at the senior officer, then back at Seagal. His voice was soft but steady. "Sir, I owe you an apology. Not just for the way I acted, but for the way I thought. You didn't have to forgive me, but you did." Seagal nodded. "Forgiveness is part of leadership. You can't guide others if you can't understand their mistakes." He placed a hand on Blake's shoulder. "You learned something today. Not from a textbook, but from experience. That lesson will stick with you longer than any rule or regulation ever will." Blake took a deep breath and said, "Thank you, sir. I won't forget it." The dean stepped forward and clapped his hands once. "All right, class. I think we can agree this was more than just a lecture. This was real education." The students clapped again, louder this time. A few even stood up, giving Seagal a small standing ovation. But Seagal raised his hand modestly, motioning for them to sit. "No need for that," he said with a calm smile. "If you really want to thank me, live the lesson. Don't judge before you know. Don't react before you listen. And above all, respect before authority." The class murmured in agreement, several students nodding deeply. Then Seagal turned to the whiteboard again and wrote one final word beneath respect and awareness: humility. He stepped aside and said, "That's the hardest one to master. The world will always test your patience, your pride, your discipline, but humility, that's your shield. It protects your heart from arrogance and your mind from ignorance." As he spoke, one of the students raised her phone again, capturing his words. "Sir," she said, "you don't mind if we post this, do you?" Seagal smiled. "Go ahead. Maybe someone out there needs to hear it more than we do." That one moment, that short clip of Seagal's calm wisdom and Officer Blake standing humbly beside him, would soon explode across the internet. It would be shared by officers, teachers, parents, and students worldwide. The caption would read, "He demanded Steven Seagal's ID," until he saw the law degree on the wall. And millions would comment things like, "Respect is earned, not given." This should be shown in every police academy. Seagal just taught the world a masterclass in humility. But for Seagal, it wasn't about the fame or the views or the praise. It was about what he'd always stood for: discipline, respect, and awareness. He looked at Blake one last time before leaving and said, "You did well today. Not because you were right, but because you chose to learn." Then, with that calm, steady walk that made him who he was, Steven Seagal picked up his jacket, nodded to the dean, and walked out of the classroom, leaving behind a silence filled with reflection and respect. If you were in Steven Seagal's place, would you forgive Officer Blake or make an example out of him? Drop your answer in the comments below and type respect if you believe humility is the strongest power of all. By the next morning, the entire world knew what had happened inside that classroom. The clip, just 2 minutes long, had already crossed 50 million views overnight. The title alone was enough to make anyone click. He demanded Steven Seagal's ID, then saw the law degree on the wall. Across social media, reactions poured in from every corner of the globe. This is what real discipline looks like. Seagal didn't humiliate him, he educated him. Respect isn't taught in books. It's shown in moments like this. News channels replayed the footage on loop. Talk shows dissected the incident. Hashtags like "Khan respects Seagal" and "Lesson in Humility" trended for days. But while the internet turned the story into a viral sensation, Steven Seagal went on with his life as quietly as ever. He wasn't chasing attention, he never had been. For him, That classroom moment wasn't about fame or proving a point. It was about restoring something the world had started to forget, the human side of respect. Meanwhile, Officer Blake Turner sat in his small apartment, scrolling through his phone, reading the comments under the viral video. Each one hit differently. Some mocked him, others defended him, but the ones that stood out the most were the ones thanking him for learning. Props to the officer for owning his mistake. Takes a real man to admit when he's wrong. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling deeply. It wasn't easy being the face of public embarrassment, but he knew something had changed in him. That moment in the classroom had stripped away his arrogance and replaced it with something stronger: awareness. The next day, Blake walked into Dean Roberts' office. Seagal was already there, sipping tea quietly as if he'd been expecting him. Blake stood at attention, then said, "Sir, I just wanted to thank you, again, not just for forgiving me, but for teaching me something I didn't even know I needed." Seagal smiled faintly. "You don't owe me thanks, son. You owe yourself growth. You made the choice to listen. That's what matters." Blake nodded, his voice trembling slightly. "That video, it's everywhere. People are calling me names, laughing at me. But honestly, I don't care anymore. Because if even one person learned from my mistake, it was worth it." Seagal's eyes softened. That's how leaders are made. Through humility, not perfection. The dean leaned forward, smiling proudly. "Officer Turner, I think Mr. Seagal would agree. Your lesson didn't just stay in this classroom. It spread across the world." Blake chuckled softly. "Yeah, I guess I went viral for the wrong reason, but the right message." Seagal stood, walked over, and extended his hand. "You went viral because you represented every young officer who's ever let pride cloud their purpose. Now you get to represent something else, change." Blake shook his hand firmly. "I won't waste that chance." Seagal nodded approvingly. "Then you've already redeemed yourself." Outside the office, a small group of students had gathered, waiting for one last glimpse of the man whose lesson had touched millions. When Seagal stepped out, the crowd erupted in applause. Some held up their phones, others simply stood with their hands over their hearts. One student called out, "Mr. Seagal, what's the one thing you want people to remember from all this?" Seagal paused, turned, and smiled. That calm, steady look in his eyes. "Respect isn't about who's in charge," he said. "It's about recognizing the worth in every person, even when they don't recognize it in you." The crowd went silent, moved by the simplicity of the words. Then, as Seagal turned to leave, another student shouted, "You're a legend, sir." Seagal chuckled softly. Legends fade, but lessons last forever. He walked away, his silhouette framed by the morning sun streaming through the campus windows. Calm, humble, and quietly powerful. Later that week, the university released an official statement thanking Seagal for his guest lecture. But they didn't call it a seminar or a class. They titled it, "A Masterclass in Respect." The video continued to spread for months, shared in police academies, classrooms, and leadership workshops worldwide. And somewhere, behind all the noise and praise, one truth stood out clearly. Steven Seagal didn't just teach a law class that day. He taught the world a lesson it would never forget. If you believe no one should ever be judged by appearance, and that true strength lies in humility, type respect in the comments and hit subscribe for more real stories that inspire and uplift.